My name is Emily, and a few years ago I believed my life was safe, my marriage was strong, and my future was secure. When I married my husband, Michael, I truly believed I had chosen a man who would never walk away from me. He was kind in the beginning, patient with my fears, gentle with my heart, and very good at saying the words every woman longs to hear. He promised me stability, loyalty, and a family built on trust. And because I loved him deeply, I believed every promise without doubt. Our marriage began quietly, without luxury or drama, but with a sense of comfort that made me feel protected in a world that often feels uncertain. We lived in a small apartment, worked hard, planned carefully, and spoke often about the future we wanted to build together. Michael used to talk about becoming a father with a strange softness in his voice, and I remember thinking that this man would one day be a wonderful parent, someone who would never allow his child to feel abandoned or unloved. When I discovered I was pregnant, the moment felt unreal, as if my life had suddenly stepped into a story I had imagined for years, but never truly believed would arrive so soon. I remember standing alone in the bathroom, holding the test in my trembling hands, feeling a strange mixture of fear, joy, and disbelief as I stared at the 2 lines that quietly announced that another life had already begun inside me. I told Michael that same evening, and he smiled in a way that convinced me everything would be fine. He hugged me, told me that we would manage, that we would be good parents, and that our family was finally beginning. I held on to that moment for a long time, because it became one of the last memories in which I still believed completely in the man I had married. The first months of my pregnancy passed slowly and carefully. I followed every instruction the doctor gave me, avoided every risk, and tried to protect this fragile life growing inside me with all the strength I had. I spoke to my unborn child every night, telling stories about the father who would one day guide them through life, about the home we would create together, and about the love that I believed would surround us as a family. But somewhere between my 3rd and 4th month of pregnancy, something inside my marriage began to change, in a way that I could not immediately understand. Michael started coming home later than usual, then later than late, and sometimes not coming home at all. His phone was always in his hand, but rarely in mine. And whenever I asked simple questions about his day, his answers became short, distracted, and distant. At first, I told myself that I was being unfair, that work must be stressful, that pregnancy makes women overly sensitive, and that I should not create problems where none existed. I tried to be patient, to be understanding, to be the kind of wife who does not complain when her husband seems tired or distracted. I reminded myself that relationships change, that responsibilities grow, and that not every silence means danger. But silence has a strange way of revealing truths that words try to hide. By the time I reached my 5th month of pregnancy, I had begun to notice how rarely Michael looked at me anymore, how his eyes no longer followed my movements, how his hands no longer rested on my growing belly with the same tenderness as before. He stopped asking about my doctor visits, stopped asking about the baby, stopped noticing the small fears that filled my mind as my body changed in ways I could not control. There were nights when I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, wondering how 2 people could share the same bed and still feel separated by a distance that felt impossible to cross. I often placed my hands on my stomach and whispered promises to my unborn child, promising protection, love, and a future that I was no longer completely sure I could provide alone. One evening, as I prepared dinner and waited for Michael to come home, I felt a sudden sharp pain in my lower back that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I tried calling him several times, but he did not answer. That night, I went alone to the hospital, sat alone in the waiting room, and listened alone as the doctor told me that stress could seriously harm my pregnancy if I did not find a way to rest and calm my mind. I wanted to explain to the doctor that my life itself had become the source of stress. But there are some truths that are too complicated to express in a few simple words. From that day forward, I understood that my pregnancy was no longer something I was sharing with my husband, but something I was carrying almost entirely on my own. I continued attending my appointments, continued following every instruction, and continued pretending both to myself and to others that everything in my marriage was still normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Michael became more distant with each passing week. Sometimes he did not come home for 2 or 3 nights in a row. When I asked where he had been, his answers were vague and careless, as if my questions were an inconvenience rather than a concern. I began to notice the smell of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes, the sudden secrecy around his phone, and the way he avoided any conversation that involved our future or our child. Still, I refused to believe what my heart was already telling me. It is a strange thing how love can blind a person so completely, even when the truth is standing directly in front of them. The night everything finally collapsed was quiet and ordinary in a way that now feels cruel. Michael came home earlier than usual, sat down across from me, and told me calmly that he was unhappy, that marriage was not what he wanted anymore, and that he felt trapped by responsibilities he was not ready to accept. As he spoke, I remember feeling as if my body had suddenly become very heavy, as if even breathing required effort. I held my belly instinctively, not only to protect my child, but to remind myself that I was not completely alone in that moment. I asked him what he meant, what he planned to do, and what would happen to our baby. He said he needed time to think. That same night, he packed a small bag and left our home, promising that he would return once he had cleared his mind. I watched him walk out of the door, and although he did not say goodbye, I somehow understood that this was not a temporary departure, but the beginning of an abandonment that would change my life forever. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. He did not call. He did not visit. He did not ask about the baby. I went to every doctor appointment alone, listened to my child's heartbeat alone, and returned each evening to a home that felt emptier with every passing day. I began to save money quietly, prepare myself emotionally, and accept the possibility that I might soon be raising a child without a husband. The truth finally reached me not through honesty, but through coincidence. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, I saw a photograph that froze my hands and made my vision blur. Michael was standing beside another woman, smiling the same smile he once gave to me, and the caption beneath the picture announced their engagement. In that moment, I understood that my marriage had already ended long before I had been brave enough to admit it to myself. When I finally spoke to him, he did not deny anything. He did not apologize. He only said that he no longer loved me, that he had made a mistake, and that he wanted to start a new life with someone else. Within weeks, divorce papers arrived, while I was still pregnant, while I was still carrying his child. I moved back to my parents' house, returned as a woman who had failed in the eyes of society, and learned very quickly how lonely a pregnant divorce can be. People whispered, relatives judged, and some even suggested that I must have done something to deserve being abandoned. But the deepest pain did not come from the judgment of others, that it came from the realization that the man who had promised to protect me forever had chosen to walk away at the moment when I needed him most. And then, just when I believed nothing could hurt me more, I received a wedding invitation. Michael was marrying her, while I was still pregnant with his child. That was the moment I finally understood that my life would never return to what it once was, and that the real struggle of my story was only beginning. After I received the wedding invitation, I stopped pretending that I was strong. Until that moment, I had been forcing myself to believe that I could survive anything, that I was capable of rebuilding my life alone, and that becoming a single mother would not destroy me. But when I held that small envelope in my hands and read the words that announced my husband's new beginning, something inside me finally broke in a way that I could no longer hide. I remember sitting on the edge of my childhood bed, the same bed I had slept in as a girl, holding that invitation while my stomach tightened with pain and fear, realizing that I was about to become a mother in a world where my child's father had already chosen a different family. From that day, my pregnancy no longer felt like a blessing. It felt like a battle. Every morning I woke up with fear in my chest, wondering how I would raise a child alone, how I would pay for everything, how I would protect a baby in a life that had suddenly become so unstable. My parents tried to comfort me, but they were old, tired, and worried, and I could see in their eyes that they were afraid for my future as much as I was. As my belly grew heavier, my heart grew more anxious. There were nights when I could not sleep at all. Nights when I lay awake listening to the sound of my parents moving quietly in the house. Ashamed that I had returned to them not as a successful married woman, but as a divorced daughter who needed help again. I often placed my hands on my stomach and begged my child to forgive me for bringing them into a life that already felt broken. The days passed slowly, one after another, until the morning arrived when I went into labor. I went to the hospital. With my mother, carrying a small bag and a heart full of fear, knowing that this moment, which should have been shared with a loving husband, would instead be faced without the man who had created this life with me. The pain of labor was strong, but the loneliness was stronger. And when I finally heard my baby cry for the first time, my tears were not only from relief, but from the deep sadness of knowing that the child in my arms had already been abandoned by their father. When the nurse placed my baby in my arms, I felt a strange mixture of love and terror. I loved this tiny life more than I had ever loved anything before. And I was terrified that I would not be able to protect them. In the days that followed, as I recovered in the hospital, I waited for a call that never came. Michael did not visit. He did not send a message. He did not ask whether his child was healthy. I went home with my newborn in my arms, returned to my parents' small house, and began my life as a single mother in a silence that felt endless. The first months were the hardest of my life. My body was weak. My mind was exhausted and my heart was constantly afraid. I woke up many times each night to feed my baby, then lay awake afterward wondering how I would manage when my parents were no longer able to help me. I worried about money, about work, about childcare, and about the future that now rested entirely on my shoulders. Sometimes I stood beside my baby's crib and cried quietly, not because I regretted becoming a mother, but because I was afraid that love alone would not be enough to protect us from the hardships that were waiting ahead. When my child was 3 months old, I finally gathered the courage to contact Michael again. I did not call him to beg. I did not call him to accuse. I called him because I believed, foolishly, that a man would at least want to know the child he had created. I told him that our baby had been born healthy. I told him that he had a son. I told him that his child deserved to know who their father was. His response was short and cold. He said that he had already started a new life. He said that his wife did not want complications. He said that it would be better if I raised the child alone. And then he told me something that I will never forget. He said that he was not ready to be a father. In that moment, I finally understood that I was truly alone, not because I had no family. Not because I had no home, but because the man who should have stood beside me had chosen to erase both me and his child from his life. The months turned into a year. I found a small job, worked long hours, left my baby with my parents during the day, and returned each evening exhausted but determined to provide everything my child needed. My life became a routine of work, feeding, cleaning, and worrying. But slowly, very slowly, I began to feel a strange new strength growing inside me. I learned how to survive. I learned how to make decisions alone. I learned how to protect my child without anyone else's help. And I learned how to live with a wound that would never fully heal. 2 years passed, then 3. I watched my son take his first steps, say his first words, and grow into a child who smiled easily and trusted the world completely. And every time I looked at him, I felt both pride and sadness, knowing that he would grow up without ever knowing the man who had given him life. I never spoke badly about his father. I never told my son that he had been abandoned. I only told him that sometimes adults make choices they cannot fix. I thought my story had ended there. I thought my life would remain quiet and predictable. I thought I would never see Michael again. But life has a strange way of reopening wounds just when you believe they have finally closed. One evening when my son was almost 4 years old, there was a knock on my parents' door. I opened it without thinking. And standing in front of me was the man who had destroyed my life. Michael looked different. Older. Tired. And afraid. For a moment neither of us spoke. I stood there holding the door, my heart beating so loudly that I was afraid he could hear it, and in that silence, I understood that the past I had worked so hard to bury had just returned to my life. He asked if he could come in. Against my better judgment, I allowed him to enter. We sat in the small living room where I had once cried through my pregnancy. And for the first time in years, I looked directly at the man who had abandoned me and our child. He told me that his marriage had failed. He told me that his wife had left him. He told me that he had lost his job. And then, with a voice that trembled, he told me that he had made the biggest mistake of his life by leaving me. As he spoke, I listened in silence, watching a man finally realize the cost of his choices. Then he said something that changed everything. He said that he wanted to meet his son. And in that moment, I realized that my real test was not in surviving abandonment. My real test was about to begin in deciding whether a man who had walked away once deserved to walk back into our lives again. After Michael told me that he wanted to meet his son, I did not answer him immediately. In that moment, I felt as if my entire past and my entire future were standing in front of me at the same time, demanding a decision that I was not emotionally prepared to make. I had spent years teaching myself how to live without him, how to raise a child without him, how to protect my heart from the memory of what he had done to us. And now he was sitting in my parents' small living room, asking to step back into a life he had abandoned so easily. I asked him why he had come, not why he had left his wife, not why his life had fallen apart, but why, after 4 years of silence, he suddenly remembered that he had a child. He told me that loneliness had finally taught him what responsibility meant. He told me that losing everything had forced him to understand the value of what he had thrown away. He told me that every night he thought about the son he had never seen. I listened quietly, not because I believed him completely, but because I needed to understand whether this man was still capable of hurting us again. When he finally left that evening, I did not promise him anything. I only told him that I needed time. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake beside my son, listening to his soft breathing, watching his small chest rise and fall, and wondering how a child who had grown in such pain could look so peaceful. I thought about the years I had spent protecting him from a truth he was too young to understand, and I asked myself whether allowing his father into his life would bring him healing or bring him new wounds. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. My mother was afraid. My father was angry. Both of them reminded me of the woman I had been when Michael left me, of the months I had cried myself to sleep, of the nights I had returned from work exhausted and hopeless, of the way I had nearly lost myself trying to survive abandonment. They begged me to protect my child from a man who had already proven that he could walk away. And for a long time, I believed they were right. But there is a strange part of motherhood that few people understand. No matter how much a man hurts you, when you look at your child, you cannot stop yourself from wondering whether they deserve the chance to know both the people who created them. After many weeks of thinking, worrying and arguing with myself, I finally agreed to let Michael see his son, not as a father, not as a part of our family, only as a man who wanted to look at the child he had never once tried to know. We agreed to meet in a public park on a Sunday afternoon. I arrived early, holding my son's hand, feeling as if I were walking toward a moment that could change the rest of our lives. When Michael arrived, he stopped a few steps away from us and simply stared. For a long time he did not speak. He only looked at the child who shared his eyes, his hair, and his face. My son looked up at him with curiosity, not knowing that this stranger was the man who had once promised to protect us both. Michael's hands were shaking when he finally knelt down and introduced himself. He did not say he was his father. He only said his name. I watched that first meeting with a heart that felt torn in two. Part of me wanted to take my child and walk away. Another part of me wanted to believe that this moment could heal something that had been broken for too long. For the next few months, Michael asked to see his son regularly. Always in public. Always with me, present. Always carefully. At first, my son treated him like any other stranger. He was polite. He was curious. But there was no emotional connection, and that was exactly how I wanted it to remain. But slowly, very slowly, I began to see changes. Michael brought small gifts. He asked about school. He listened when my son spoke. He showed a patience that I had never seen in him before. And against my will, against my fears, I began to wonder whether people truly could change. Then one afternoon, something happened that frightened me more than I was willing to admit. When it was time to leave the park, my son hugged Michael goodbye. It was a simple, innocent hug, but it felt like a knife in my heart. That night, I realized that I was no longer protecting only myself. I was protecting a child who was slowly becoming emotionally attached to a man who had once walked away without looking back. From that day forward, my fear returned stronger than before. I began to watch Michael more carefully. I listened to the way he spoke. I noticed the promises he started to make. I heard him say that he wanted to be a real father, that he wanted to help, that he wanted to be part of our lives. And the more he said these things, the more afraid I became, because I knew what abandonment does to a child. I knew how deeply a second betrayal could destroy a heart that was still learning how to trust. I tried to set boundaries. I tried to slow everything down. But Michael began to push gently, asking to spend time alone with his son, asking to take him to his apartment, asking to introduce him to friends as his child. Every request felt like a test, and every test felt dangerous. Then one evening, Michael told me something that changed everything again. He told me that he wanted to go to court. Not to fight me, but to ask for legal rights as a father. In that moment, all my old fear returned at once. I realized that this was no longer only about emotions. It was about control. It was about power. It was about a man who had once escaped responsibility, now wanting to reclaim authority. For the first time in years, I felt truly threatened. I consulted a lawyer. I prepared documents. I gathered every record of abandonment. And slowly, painfully, I prepared myself for a legal battle I had never wanted. When the court date arrived, I walked into that building feeling as if I were walking back into the worst years of my life. Michael stood on the other side, looking confident, speaking about redemption, about mistakes, about wanting to correct the past, and I stood there speaking about abandonment, about silence, about a child who had survived without a father. The judge listened carefully. The case lasted months, and during those months, my son began to sense that something was wrong. He asked questions. He noticed tension. He asked why. I was often sad again. And every time he asked, my heart broke a little more. Finally, the decision came. Michael was granted limited visitation rights. Not custody. Not control. Only supervised visits. It was a victory. But it did not feel like one. Because now, my life was permanently connected again to the man I had tried so hard to leave behind. The visits continued. The attachment grew, and the fear inside me never fully disappeared. Then one day, without warning, Michael stopped coming. He missed one visit. Then another. Then another. He stopped calling, stopped answering messages, stopped asking about his son. Weeks passed, then months. And slowly, painfully, I understood what was happening. History was repeating itself. One evening, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked me a question that I had always feared. He asked me why his father did not come anymore. I sat beside him in silence for a long time, searching for words that would not destroy his innocence. And in that moment, I finally understood something that took me years to accept. Some people do not abandon you once. They abandon you every time. They are given another chance. And as I watched my child fall asleep with confusion in his eyes, I realized that my final lesson was still waiting for me. Because the greatest test of my life was not surviving betrayal, but learning when to close a door forever for the sake of the child I loved more than my own heart. After Michael disappeared from our lives for the second time, I spent a long time waiting for a pain that I believed would destroy me. At first, I woke up every morning with a heavy feeling in my chest, expecting to collapse under the weight of disappointment and anger. But strangely, what came instead was a quiet emptiness that slowly settled into my daily life. It was not the kind of pain that makes you cry loudly, but the kind that follows you silently from room to room, reminding you of everything you once hoped would be different. For weeks, I told myself that he might return again. I told myself that maybe he had lost courage, that maybe he was ashamed, that maybe this time he would come back with a real explanation. But as days passed without a single call, a single message, or a single sign of regret, I finally accepted the truth that I had been avoiding for years. Some people do not leave because they are confused. They leave because they are incapable of carrying responsibility. Life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. I woke up early, prepared my son for school, went to work, returned home, cooked dinner, helped with homework, listened to stories about classmates and teachers, and every night, when the house became quiet again, I sat alone in my small bedroom and allowed myself to feel everything I had been trying to hide during the day. I thought about the young woman I had once been, the woman who believed in marriage, the woman who believed in forever, the woman who believed that carrying a man's child meant he would never abandon her. And I mourned her quietly, not because she had been weak, but because she had been innocent. My son changed after his father disappeared again. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that others noticed, but in small, painful details that only a mother can see. He stopped asking when his father would visit again. He stopped keeping his drawings to show him. He stopped mentioning his name at all. At first, I thought this was a good sign. I believe that children forget quickly. That time heals everything. But slowly, I began to realize that he was not forgetting. He was learning how to bury disappointment. There were nights when I found him sitting quietly on his bed, staring at nothing, and when I asked what he was thinking about, he always said the same thing. Nothing. But a mother always knows when nothing means everything. For a long time, I blamed myself. I blamed myself for allowing Michael back into our lives. I blamed myself for believing that people can change simply because they regret the consequences of their choices. I blamed myself for exposing my child to a second abandonment that could have been avoided. And in that guilt, I nearly lost myself again. I worked more, slept less, pushed my feelings aside, and tried to convince myself that strength meant silence. Then one evening, something happened that changed everything. Inside me. My son was almost 8 years old. We were sitting together at the kitchen table, working on a simple school assignment, when he suddenly stopped writing and looked at me in a way that frightened me. He asked me whether I believed that children can make their parents leave. At first, I did not understand the question. I asked him what he meant, and with a voice that was very calm, he said that maybe his father had left again because he had not behaved well enough, because he had not been smart enough. Because he had not been interesting enough, because he had not been worth staying for. In that moment, I felt as if my heart had been torn open. I realized that abandonment does not only hurt the person who is left behind. It teaches children to believe that love must be earned, that presence must be deserved, that they are responsible for the failures of adults. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat beside his bed for a long time, watching his face, and I understood something very clearly. Protecting a child does not only mean feeding them, clothing them, and educating them. It means protecting their sense of worth. From that day forward, I made a promise to myself. Michael would never again have the power to hurt my child. Not directly, not indirectly, not through absence, not through broken promises. I blocked his number. I closed every possible path back into our lives. And for the first time in many years, I stopped waiting. Instead of waiting for someone who had proven he could not stay, I focused on building a life that did not depend on anyone's return. I worked harder. I took evening classes. I improved my qualifications. I saved every small amount of money I could. After 2 years, I moved out of my parents' house into a small apartment with my son. It was not beautiful. It was not large, but it was ours. A place where no one disappeared without explanation. A place where no one broke promises. A place where safety was not something we waited for, but something we created ourselves. Slowly, life became lighter, not easy, but lighter. My son grew stronger. He made friends. He laughed more. He became curious about the world in a way that filled me with pride. And as he grew, I learned something important about healing. Healing does not come suddenly. It comes quietly. In small moments. In ordinary days. In the realization that you can breathe again without pain in your chest. Years passed. My son entered his teenage years. He became taller than me. Stronger than me. And in many ways, wiser than me. He never spoke about his father again, not once. And I respected that silence. When he turned 16, something unexpected happened. I received a letter. Not an email. Not a message. A handwritten letter. It was from Michael. In that letter, he wrote that he was ill, that he had been diagnosed with a serious disease, that his life had fallen apart completely, that his second marriage had ended badly, that he had no family left, and that he wanted to see his son one last time. As I read that letter, I did not feel anger, I did not feel hatred, I did not even feel sadness. I felt tired. Tired of a story that had already taken too many years of my life. For many days, I did not answer. I thought about what I should do. Not as a woman, not as an ex-wife, but as a mother. I asked myself whether meeting a dying man would bring my child peace or confusion, whether it would give him closure or reopen wounds that had taken years to close. I asked myself whether a man who had abandoned his child twice deserved a final chance simply because he was afraid of dying alone. In the end, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I wrote back, and I said no. Not with anger. Not with cruelty, only with honesty. I told him that my son was finally at peace, that he had built a life without him, that reopening this chapter would not bring healing, and that some consequences cannot be undone. No matter how deep the regret becomes. Michael died 6 months later. When I heard the news, I closed my eyes and whispered a small prayer. Not for forgiveness. Not for revenge. Only for a man who had spent his life running away from responsibility. Today, my son is grown. He is studying at university. He works part-time. He dreams of a future that is wide and open. He knows the full truth now. All of it. And one evening, not long ago, he asked me a question that I will never forget. He asked me whether I ever regretted not trying harder to save my marriage. I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Then I told him the truth. I told him that I once believed a woman must sacrifice herself to save a family. But life taught me something different. That sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is walk away from a man who refuses to walk with her. I told him that leaving his father was not my failure. It was my survival. And that raising him alone was not my weakness. It was my greatest strength. When I look back at my life now, I do not see a story of betrayal. I see a story of endurance, of a woman who learned to stand alone, of a child who learned resilience. Of a family that was not created by marriage, but by courage. This is how my story ends. Not with revenge. Not with regret, but with peace. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who may be silently suffering today. Because sometimes, one story can give another person the strength to choose themselves.